Greetings and welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for a video that I've wanted to make for quite some time and just hadn't sat down and done, but we're going to do it today. And that is forging without a forge. Now, I've wanted to do this for a while to talk to folks that have a little bit of interest in blacksmithing and metalwork, but are intimidated by everything that you need to set up a full forge. And there are things that you need a full forge, regardless of fuel, whether that's propane, charcoal, wood turned into charcoal. I forged even over corn, coal, or, and any other fuel that you might use. A full forge to get to the highest heats, to do the highest heat requiring processes, such as drawing out, which is where you're stretching the material for either length or width, and forge welding. Those operations require a forced air forge. You cannot do those with the setup that I'm going to be puttering with this afternoon. But there's a lot of things that you can do at a much lower heat, okay? Gentle bending can be done at a low heat, or I should say a medium heat, okay? You don't want to do it at a really low heat or you'll start to work hard in your piece. But at a lower heat, you can bend. You can hot rasp, you can anneal. At the higher end of medium heat, right after you get it right at critical temperature is where you quench. And then at even lower heat, you can planish, which is where you're just very softly ironing out wrinkles in the surface of your metal. That's done at a dull red or a black red, or a black hot, okay? And tempering is a very low temperature operation. So we can't get to the high heat, but we can get to medium heats with a naturally drafted wood fire. And this is something that is done traditionally. I am going to be taking some inspiration from a couple of different things and making a utility camp knife, small utility camp knife, from some junk long spring trap strings. Okay? I'm going to get these set up in the fire, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the context of this. So my fire, I have had this burning for an hour or so now, had some smaller sized wood, and it's burnt down to a nice bed of really, really hot coals. And I guess I could just do it with these. I'm going to take and I'm going to set these with the bend that I'm going to want to straighten out here to the inside. Okay. And then I'm going to build a nice log cabin style fire over them so that I have a nice draft, a nice natural draft from the front, from the back, and from both sides. And I'm just going to put one more piece up on top here to hold that heat. Now I can already see these coals are starting to get nice and warm in there. So a little bit of blowing and that'll heat up quite nicely. Now it won't take but a little bit of time, and that's gonna come off. We'll get some nice flames, and we'll have a nice oven roasting our little trap springs. And while they get hot, this is going to take a little bit. I could get these hot in less than 10 minutes, probably less than 5 minutes in my coal forge. And I've shown you using that. I'll put a link in the end screen to the video where we forge a crooked knife from scratch, where we do drawing, bending, all sorts of forging. We don't forge weld anything there, but we do most of the common forging operations in that video, making that little woodworking tool, okay? We can't do all of this, and it's going to take a lot longer to get these up to heat, but you'll see we can do some things like this, and this is a very traditional way to work metal, especially here in North America. I've heard people say before, and it kind of sets my hair on fire a little bit, that native people don't have an internal autochthonous metalworking tradition. And that is just not true, okay? Copper exists in the Great Lakes region as native copper nuggets. And it was, okay, I'm going to come forward out of the smoke a little bit. And
It's gonna follow you.
it's going to follow, yeah, it's going to follow me, whatever. We'll deal with it. I will blink and cringe with the smoke for you, my viewers. I love you this much. I love you this much. Okay. So the copper deposit was hidden under the glaciers until about 10,000 years ago. And then around about 10,000 years ago, those glaciers melted and exposed a landscape riddled with native copper nuggets. Okay? And very quickly thereafter, they started to be used by the native people of that area. Okay, I love you this much. I don't love you that much anymore. But we'll move forward. As the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago, they exposed a landscape just strewn with native copper nuggets, ready, shining red, not oxidized because they were frozen. As they were beat out of the host rock by the glaciers, they were, frozen and just left shining red nuggets there on the surface. And it did not take long for people to start to realize that this is a useful material. Okay? And that evolved into the Great Lakes, what's often called by archaeologists the Great Lakes copper culture. Now, it's very, very difficult to date these tools because they, you can't date copper. You can't date when copper was hammered, right? So you have to date it by context. And unfortunately, we have a problem with metal detectorists going all over and digging these things up. They never know there was an archaeology site. And the archaeologists dig the site, never know there was copper. So the archaeology and the dating of these is extraordinarily problematic. But if we assume that they were used at or very close to the time when they were exposed, then Native Americans are the world's oldest metallurgical culture. Okay? They will have beat both Europe and the Middle East to copper, assuming that we go with a somewhere around 10,000 year date when those were exposed. And there's no reason to assume that would not be true, because think about it, you're basically living in a campsite, you have stone tools, you pick up a funny rock and notice that it has interesting properties. You're going to start playing with it. And, okay, apparently I love you this much again. And you know how campfire smoke is. Anyway, I'm going to continue. So, there's no reason to assume that there was very much of a time delay. Okay? That copper was traded all the way down into Central and South America. Around the time we get into the woodland period, it starts to, the surface available resources start to dwindle a bit, and you have native copper from the Central America and the southwestern states starting to be traded north to continue supplying copper up to the mid-continent and the northeast. And a little bit after that, when those resources start to dwindle a little bit, I forget exactly which group did it first, but 300-400 years, somewhere in, it's not exactly correct, but it's close enough for this conversation, before contact, you have the smelting of copper ore with a hot directed blast smelting apparatus, very similar to what's seen in early chalcolithic technologies in the Middle East, develops before contact, a few hundred years before contact, within the Mesoamerican cultures. So those cultures developed their own metallurgy. They did not learn silversmithing from the Spanish. They knew how to smith metals. They got an abundant silver resource from the Spanish and adopted this new abundant resource to the pre-existing technologies. Okay. Same in South America, you have forms of lost glass casting that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Very unique forms of lost glass casting. They're very efficient in their use of precious metals to make things, okay, throughout South America. So you have very well developed traditional metallurgical cultures. In the high Arctic, you even have ironwork pre-contact. Northeastern Canada, Greenland, a group of tribes with very well developed use of meteoric iron pre-contact. And in the Pacific Northwest, you have very well developed pre-human contact iron, but it's Chinese iron coming over from shipwrecks and flotsam and stuff, because the currents direct a lot of driftwood and a lot of that driftwood has nails in it. So for hundreds of years before, what are we doing? Oh, okay, we just got into some better fuel there. Okay, found a pine cone or something. A few hundred years before contact, you have that coming over. Okay. Now, these copper ingot work-based technologies are doing a lot of what we're doing here. It's a cold hammering process. You take your copper ingot, and you're just going to use a hammer stone and a stone anvil, and you're just going to hammer it. When you hammer copper, you get a few hammers, and then you'll start to feel it getting harder, and you'll start to make less progress, and you'll start to feel it getting harder, okay? And if you keep going, the copper will start to split and crack. But to prevent that, when you start to lose your ability to make progress and feel your ingot getting harder, you put it in a campfire and heat it up and then quench it in water, and it gets soft again. It's an annealing process. You can quench non-ferrous metals at red heat, and they will still come out in the annealed condition. So the way native peoples, pre-contact native peoples, are working this copper resource is cold hammering, anneal it, quench it. Cold hammer some more, anneal it, quench it. Cold hammer some more, so forth and so on. Now when you get to the contact period, you get a whole lot of metal working its way through the new trade networks. And it's not always what you want, right? Maybe, you can't just go to a big giant stuff mart and get whatever darn widget or thingamadoodad you're looking for. You're going to a trade blanket and anything metal could show up, but it's almost certainly not the metal object you wanted. So you see a whole pile of technologies develop around taking what came up on the trade blanket that week and turning it into what you actually need for your family. And a lot of that is modeled after this cold work copper technology. So people learn very, very quickly to, what metals can be broken, what metals can be carved, what metals can be worked in a fire, and using them accordingly. A cast iron pan, if you don't need a pan, can be physically shattered and then ground like you would grind slate to make an adze head or a scraper. There's a lot of those archaeologically. And in the Pacific Northwest in particular, we see a lot of trap springs being made into knives of various sorts.
Interesting.
So what we're doing is a very, very traditional art form. And let's see where we are and how much heat we have. Those are the ones that are too wide. There's the one they want. Okay. While this is in there, I can see it's kind of at a black red. I do want a bit more heat than that. So I'm going to choke on the smoke, stir the fire, and I'm going to give this a few minutes and we'll come back on. Now, these are about ready. You're not going to be able to see inside my fire pile, but what I'm doing is laying down on my belly, literally, looking in. And when the metal at the bend of this trap spring is the same color as the coals, that's when it's ready. So I'm going to keep it in here. I'm going to grab it with both pairs. I'm going to stretch it out. I'm going to put it here on the block of wood. And we're just going to flatten it. All we want to do is flatten this. Okay? And wood is great for this because it's going to prevent you from putting any big old dings in it. Okay? Now, how flat are we? It's also going to prevent you from trying to over deform it and do more than you really ought to at this heat. Okay. So there we go. Now we have a straight piece of steel, right? Now I'm going to put this back in as far in as I can. And the next thing that we want to do with this, and I'll rebuild the fire a little bit so it's completely enveloped, is anneal it. But I'm going to do these other two here while I'm at it. It's the wrong one. Here's the right ones. Okay, get everything ready. Keep it in the heat. as long as you can. And then work quickly as you can once it gets out of the heat. And you can do more than tickle it, you know, the wood will prevent you from going to the point that you would overstress the metal. If you were doing this at this heat, again, I'm just trying for straight, over a metal anvil, you could absolutely destroy your steel. But since I'm doing this on a wooden anvil, the give and bounce of the wood is going to prevent me from hitting it hard enough to do that. Okay, that one's a little bit cooler. I'm going to give that one another few minutes. I'm going to move it to a slightly hotter place in the fire. There. Going to be more the same with that. So you saw two. The other one needs a little bit more time. I'm going to rebuild this fire and get all of these nice and red. So I got that third one straightened out. These others have been in for a few minutes more. And they're warm again. Warm enough to do a little, oh my gosh, the smoke is something. Do a little bit more bending. So I'm just going to kind of check for straight on everything. And we can give it some little love taps if we have any crooked spots. That one's really good as is. That was a black hot, but I've kind of disturbed my fire a little bit, so it's probably not going to show up in the camera. But very, very dull cherry red. This one, this region is hot enough, so I can give it a couple little, there's a little bend there. A little bit of bend right in the middle yet. You can see I'm not walloping this to any great extent. It's why it's okay to do this at a lower temperature. Not stressing this metal at all. Okay. And this one's good and hot. Probably see a little bit of glow in that one. Just a little bit of straight in there. And you see this anvil is smoking, but it's not bursting into flame. This is oak. Do not do what I'm doing with pine. You have to have a hardwood to do this. Okay. Okay. Moving out of the smoke again. So those are all straight enough. They're well within file range when we start to make our finished tools. I am going to put one end in, get it nice and red, pull it out, turn it around, get the other end nice and red, and then set them here probably on top of the wood so that they stay warm and slow down slowly as the fire dies down in the evening. This is the first step of the process. Get them straight, get them soft. So these have had a nice long soak in this fire. You can see that it's kind of, my oven is starting to fall apart on me, and this happens with time. You have to rebuild it every so often. But if I start to pull these out, you can see we have that nice medium red color to them. So I'm going to look at each of these and make sure that they don't need a last little love tap somewhere. This one can use one right there. Very, very gentle. That's it. And now we leave them to cool. Just normalizing them. Taking the last little bit of hardness out if there is any. Okay. This one right there does need a last little love tap. That's not uncommon as they heat up like this. Get all the way to critical temperature, which these are. You could pull these, whip these right out and quench them. Okay. If you wanted to reharden them right away. But as that happens, if there's any stress in the metal, it will often cause the metal to warp just from the heat, not even with any pressure on it. So So just need a last little bit. And you can see these are all pretty much right where that bend was in the spring. That's where there was the most deformation. And they did retake a little bit of warp back. Not much. And now they're just going to cool there overnight. When they're cool, they will be dead soft and ready for cold work, and we'll turn them into some actual practical little knife blades and talk about that. Work at the bench. So there's quite a bit of time that you're going to have invested in the cold work portions of a project like this. So if we look at one of these that is unmodified, you can see I've been working on this a little bit here already. If we look at an unmodified one, we need to cut off one or the other ring. You can decide whether you want the fatter or the thinner ring. I decided I wanted the fatter ring on these. And to do that, just a common hacksaw makes quick work of it. Now, originally my plan was to take one of these and make sort of a Kephart-inspired cant blade and then 2 carving knives. And the first step in doing that is making paper patterns. Okay, trace your spring or whatever your stock is on a piece of paper, and then actually start working on it and cutting out and make a paper replica of the thing you're going to do. When I started doing that, I realized that there's enough steel, but it's not quite in all the right places. So the proportions were just not coming out right. So I'm going to take that one and I'm just going to set it aside and save it for another day. But the 2 carving knives, one is going to be an experiment, and I'm going to experiment with a West Coast style crooked knife. I made an East Coast style crooked knife here on the channel, and I'll put a link to that video at the top of the screen here. But the East Coast style crooked knife is nigh on impossible to get into a regular sheath. And I'm working on a set of camp tools that I want to be able to sheath together. So I'm making a West Coast style crooked knife that should be sheathable, and using this as a chance to experiment with that design. So in this case, the ring is going to be the thumb rest. And we'll talk about bending the blade when we go back to the campfire. The other is going to be a simple straight carving blade, modeled after my favorite Sloyd knife that you've seen me use many times in the channel. After you cut it out, and the hacksaw will make very quick work out of it because it's dead soft from the normalization, you just remove the metal that you don't want by filing. And you're going to file a little bit. And having filed a little bit, you'll take it out of the vise and you'll hold your pattern to it and see how it's working. Now, when you're doing this, you don't have to absolutely be a slave to your pattern. You can say, well, that looked nice on paper, but now that I'm looking at it in metal, I want to do this a little bit differently. Okay? And that's usually true. I almost never make a pattern and then have the actual tool be a literal clone of the pattern. There's always a little tinkering. But you want to make a pattern that's very, very close so that you can make decisions like I made here earlier when I said, there's just not quite the right proportions here to do a Kephart blade. We'll do a Kephart blade and we'll talk about the Kephart grind because it's a really interesting knife grind. But this project, I'm just going to stick with these and do a straight grind. So the easiest way to file on the flats, both for polishing the flats and for grinding bevels, is to take a piece of wood, just chunk a 2x4, some old scrap, put it in your vise, and then take a couple of squeezy clamps and clamp it down to your piece of wood. Okay. And then from here, when you're working on the flats, you can go to town like that. I'm not going to work on the flats right now. I'm going to heat treat it first. I will take a little bit of the scale off. But then to do your grind, a common knife is usually going to have somewhere in the 25 to 30 degree overall angle. Okay. So each side is going to be half of that. Okay. If you're doing a carving tool, and both of these are carving tools, you want to go on the steeper, more of like a 10 degree on each face. If you're doing a hacking blade design, and there is a specific hacking blade designed for batoning, for splitting and using in the shop. It is not useful for anything other than batoning, and any knife which is useful for anything other than batoning should never be batoned. But, right, then you would go more toward, 30, 35 degrees for a butcher knife where you're going to hit bone sometimes more, 25, 26, 28 degrees, somewhere in there, okay? So you can decide that. You can get jigs for that, but I don't like using jigs with anything related to this. After you get good at sharpening knives, you'll just kind of get used to the angle. Okay? And then with this held nicely, you can start working in small sections, carving in that angle. And then when you get it where you want it in that spot, you can readjust, move things around, reposition your clamps. Okay. And I know this is blocking you from the camera angle, but you can kind of see what I'm going for here. And now I can file on the tip because the tip is exposed. Okay. I'll make some noise to prove, since you can't see, that I can get in there from where I'm standing. Okay. So we'll work on this. I will take the mill scale off so that I am down to bare metal. I'm not going to be too obsessive with surface finish because I'm going to mar the surface finish in the heat treating process. And if you think about this at this stage, currently your metal is two flat planes. Okay. When it's done, I'm going to do a straight bevel. Some people call it a Scandinavian grind, but it's just a fancy modern word for a straight bevel. Which in the finished blade will look like that. At this stage, though, don't take it all the way to a true knife edge. You want to take the majority of the material off, but if you take it all the way to a sharp knife edge, when you do the heat treat, you're going to burn that edge off, and you lose all your work anyway. So, instead of going all the way to this profile, stop about there and leave a bit of a flat facet on the edge. You will finish the rest of that with sandpaper and stones after it's hardened. You don't want to do all of the grinding after it's hardened because it's a pain in the neck. But, so we want to take take all of this meat in the corners out while it's soft. But you don't want to go all the way to the knife edge. You want to stop with a flat facet. Okay? This is where the saying comes, if you wish a good edge to win, forge fat and grind thin. But you have to wait until after the heat treat to finish the saying. So I'm going to keep working on these two blades, and I'll show you what they look like when they're ready for the heat treat. Here's the finished blanks. The edges are roughed in, but again, they're blunt. Okay, these are not brought all the way to a sharp point, or that will burn off here in the fire. I like to pre-drill holes while the metal is soft. Now, I broke my darn drill bit, so I didn't get that one drilled, but we're not going to harden it all the way out here to the loop anyway. The design of these and the handles, they both have really long handles, okay? This one, we're going to bend the blade further and make it into a crooked knife, and that's going to be held palm up like that. So you can see you need that long handle length for it to be held properly, okay? And then this one, partly I wanted them to match so that they sheath together, but also one of the cuts I like to make when I'm working and carving is the palm of my left hand against the back of the blade, and then lever against the right hand. So I'm using two hands in it. Okay? And leaving the handle extended will make that particular cut much more powerful than it would otherwise. Okay? So there's a reason for the long handles. I know to a modern eye it looks a little silly to have that long of a handle, but there's a reason for this. Now I've rebuilt the fire. Color is going to be very important, being able to judge how hot your metal is. And unfortunately, the sun is right there beating down right on where we are. So you're not going to be able to see the color well. It's all going to look black because of the sunlight. I was setting up to do this last night and had an hour before dark, some clouds, perfect lighting, and then it rained. So I had to abandon the project. So we don't have the best lighting, but we will be okay. We're going to put these in here. We have our bed of coals underneath the insulation of more wood. And it's very important to set it up this way. Again, I'm having to use pliers just to get in there because there's so much radiant heat coming up out of this, right? You get hot with this setup. You're going to struggle to do full forging, like drawing and upsetting. You're going to struggle with, and you can't get a welding temperature in this. But you can get very, very hot. Plenty hot enough for all of your basic bending, softening, and heat treating. If you were to put a draft in this, you can absolutely get hot enough to do all of your forging and forge welding with charcoal and with wood. You absolutely can get hot enough to do that, as long as you can construct your fire in such a way that you can get active draft into the coal pocket and still have insulation on top. That's critical. Okay, and that's a little bit more difficult to do with wood than with coal, because the charcoal burns out so fast. There's just not as much mass. So we're going to let these heat up, and then we will talk about working on the blades. This is hot enough, I had to go grab my longer handled tongs. This gets very, very warm, right? You can generate a huge amount of heat when you build an oven like this. Again, build an initial fire, let it burn all the way down to coals, bank those coals, and wrap them in a blanket of other combustible fuel, right? You will get a lot of heat. Now, if I didn't have tongs this long, I have loops on the end of those handles. I could grab them out of the fire with a green stick and it would be okay, right? There's other ways to do this, but I have the tongs, so I'm going to use the tongs. Now, I'm not quite up to temperature for the heat treat, but it's very, very much hot enough that I can do the bend on the crooked knife. So I'm just going to grab a pair of needle nose pliers and gently lift that up a little bit. Okay. Where I want it. That's where I want it. It's got a little bit of twist in it. Took a little bit, did a little too much there. Okay, I need to go back in. Heat it up again. Take that twist out. Keep doing this, do it gently. Remember, you can see when I'm doing this, I'm not putting a huge amount of pressure on it. I'm working at a black heat. It's going to look absolutely dead black because the sun is on us. Okay? I'm working at a black heat. And, you know, like a really, really dark red, right, to black. But very, very little pressure. What ruins steel is striking it with a hard blow when it's below a forging temperature, okay? Or heating it up above the proper temperature and forcing grain growth, right? Forcing a crystalline structure to form that you don't want to form. This is very, very hot. It's not going to get hot enough to ruin the steel the latter way. It's not going to get hot enough to burn the steel. You really can't do it. There's a very gentle way to heat steel. And these little tweaks that I'm doing just with a pair of pliers is not enough force to generate stress fractures in the cooler metal. Okay? So we're working under very mild conditions. It's a little bit different from the conditions in a proper forge. And you have there's some things you have to worry about in a proper forge that you don't really have to worry about in a campfire. So, let me see, look in where we're going. Okay. It's going to need a little bit of time. I'm going to do a couple little manipulations, make sure it's absolutely straight and exactly where I want it, and then we'll go for the heat treat. Okay, so I finished bending that, got everything untwisted, got everything right the way I want it. We're good to go there. Put them back in, let them soak. Now, again, contrasting this to a forced air blast forge. In a forced air forge, you have everything much hotter than it really needs to be. So things will come up to temperature very, very quickly. But the downside is you can also burn your material very, very easily and destroy your steel. Here, we are just exactly hot enough. Okay, so it takes longer to get up to temperature. But these can sit here and soak, and nothing bad is going to happen. Okay, nothing bad's going to happen for a reasonable amount of time, right? Yes, you can always take things to an extreme enough and screw something up, but with a reasonable amount of time, nothing bad is going to happen. Okay. Now, how do you know when it's ready for the quench? Well, for most of your common tool steels, most of your common high carbon steels, the color that the coals are when they're actively burning is just about exactly the color you want your steel to be. So when the steel is the same color as the coals, it's ready. Okay? That color is going to look different. It's hard to describe this with words. You kind of have to do it and tinker with it and see what it looks like. But the color is going to look a little different in every lighting situation. Okay? Now here we've had some coals come over. Some clouds come over. So it's a little bit easier to see. And I'm going to pull the first one out and go right into the quench. Okay. Keep it moving, and do not breathe that vapor that's coming up. Okay. You don't want to just plunk it in and let it sit at one level, or you can get a really nasty hard spot. Okay. But you also don't want to pull it out and make fireballs, and you really don't want to breathe those fumes. I don't care what kind of oil it is, there is no such thing as an oil that is safe to breathe when vaporized. It collects in the surface of the lungs, and the white blood cells responsible for cleaning your lungs are really not good at getting rid of that. Okay? So you do not want to breathe that. Okay. There we go. Looks good. Check it to see if anything warped or twisted, and it doesn't appear that anything did. The single best way to keep stuff from warping and twisting is do the normalization well. Okay? If you have stress in that metal from your forging or your bending operations, or from uneven rusting and life can sometimes produce it, you can have metal that goes into the forging process when you're using recycled materials, that goes into the forging process already under stress. Okay? You have to get rid of that stress. See, yep, the other one's good too. Again, out and right in. Okay, keep it moving. Don't breathe the fumes. Step away, beloved. The fumes are coming at you. Don't want that. This one was a little bit hotter because it was in a little bit longer. Bending my own head out of the way. There we go. They can go that way. That's a happy direction for the fumes to go in. Keep doing this. Keep it in. If it doesn't harden, it wasn't hot enough. If it warps in the quench, either you didn't go in straight. It's like if you go in too sideways, yes, it can cause a warp, right? But usually when it warps in the quench, it means you didn't normalize well enough, and there was a stress there, and when you cool it down suddenly, that stress will come and bite you in the form of a warp. This is very, very thin metal. This is not even a full 1/8 inch thick. But because we're being gentle with it, we did not overheat our material. And we normalized it nice. Those both came out dead straight. Even a very, very, very thin material. Now you want to let these cool nice before you do a file test on it. And it's still probably going to be a little hot for my fingers, but yeah, it's not sizzling. It's a little on the softer side compared to like if this was file steel, and but it's only taking off the mill scale. It's not butting into the metal, so that's hard. Okay. How hard it's going to get is going to depend a lot on what steel you use. And this is where you need to know some things and be realistic. Those trap springs, they are springs. They have to have some carbon in it. Okay? But it's not going to ever get as hard as a file. It's going to be a medium carbon steel. I'm guessing from how it's behaving that that's probably, and I did do a spark test. I know there's some carbon in it, but it's not a lot. Okay? It's probably in the vicinity of 1040, 1060. Okay, something like that. This is not 1080 or 1095. It is not going to get as hard in the quench as 1080, 1095 will get, because it's a different material. The trade-off is it's going to have a tremendous amount of toughness. Okay? If I wanted to get that harder, this probably would be water hardenable, because it's a lower carbon rate. I don't want to do that. Also, when you're file testing, you need to know that you're going to burn off some of the carbon from the surface. So it's very common that it will bite in a little bit and then reach a core where it skates. Don't worry about that. That's why you leave it over thick. Okay, you will file down to that. Okay, and you will file and remove that decarburized surface. Very, very common. Also, it will bite in a little bit more now because it's still a little warm than it will in an hour when it's absolutely dead cold. Okay, so you don't want to fool yourself with the file test. Okay, it hardened. It's not biting in as it did when I was filing it on the dead soft condition. Okay, it did harden. It is as hard as it's going to get with this heat source and that cool quenching medium. Don't keep doing it. Okay. I can feel the surface is a little bit decarburized, and then it's biting into a core. That tells me it's hard. That tells me my quench worked. Move on. Let it cool. Clean it off. Sand off the decarburized surface, and you'll find your real material in the middle. That's why you leave it a little bit thick. Okay? Also be careful with what materials you choose for this. For a project like this, it needs to be fairly close in shape to what you actually want at the end. But in the modern world, there's a lot of different materials. Okay, this is plenty adequate material. Can you do this with a file? Yes, but you're going to have a failure rate because a lot of modern files are really junk steel. Okay, a lot of them are case hardened, mild steel. Okay, where they will heat them with a case hardening medium and then quench them in water, and you get that hard surface. But as soon as you file through that, the core is soft and not hardenable. That's common in files. The other thing that's common in files is air hardening steels, which will explode if you do it like this. Not with shrapnel, but they will crack, right, and go nuts on you. So if you want to use a file, you really want to use like a file from like the World War II era or older. Okay, is really going to be your best file steel. And if you use a file, you have to know that because of how they cut files, there is a stress fracture at the bottom of every tooth. So you want to soften it and then file off all of the file teeth, and then keep filing a little bit and take another 32nd of an inch off below the file teeth to get to clean material. Then you can use it. That's usually going to be 1095 or something similar to W1. It can work. A lot of people have made a lot of tools out of files, but there's a lot of extra work involved in doing it correctly because you have to get underneath the file teeth and the cracks that are at the bottom. Okay? So it's definitely not one of my favorite materials to use because of all of that extra work involved. Something like a spring, something, you know, flat, that's not going to have a high stress life. A saw blade is a good choice for this. Okay? Especially an old saw blade that does not have carbide teeth, where the teeth are the steel that is the same as the core of the saw blade. Those are a good thing to use this with, to do this process on. Big, fat, heavy-duty bandsaw blades, like the industrial bandsaw blades, is 15N20 steel. It will respond very well to this heat treatment. That's a good thing to do this on, but you want to pick your material carefully. Don't use a lawnmower blade. A lot of it is 1080 steel that was less soft, so it doesn't shatter when it hits a rock, but it has a high stress life, so it's going to have a lot of stresses and fractures in it. Okay? That's not a good material to do this with. So be a little selective and tinker, and when you're using recycled steels, know that there will be a failure rate. Now, these, yeah, those are cool enough to touch. Okay? What else am I going to do with these? Well, I need to temper them. They are too hard, and that heat shock generates too much stress to leave them just like this. There's two ways you can temper this. One is I could file off the mill scale and then hold them next to the fire and watch the colors run. Your colors are going to run light yellow, straw, dark straw brown. Then that dark straw brown turns purple, the purple turns blue, and then the blue lightens to a gray. If you take it all the way to gray, you've taken all the hardness out, and you got to start over. Okay? Don't do that. That happens between up close to 700 degrees, but not quite, Fahrenheit. Okay? Yellow and straw are where you temper graving chisels, awls, and things that are not going to see a lot of flex or impact in their life, and you want to be really, really hard. A really hard cutting blade is usually going to be like in the brown to purple range, which is between 450 and 500 degrees. And then blue starts around 500 and goes up toward, you know, the mid 500s. Okay? Blue is where you temper a spring. These would have been tempered blue in their original life. Blue will hold an edge, and you can still file on it. So you can file sharpen it. So a lot of axes and field tools are taken to that spring hardness so that you can sharpen them with a file if you need to. I want to leave this a little bit softer, so I'm going to kind of try and stay in that, or a little bit harder, so I'm going to try and stay in like that 480 to 500 brown to purple range. Okay? I'm going to do that in an oven. So I'm just going to put these in a kitchen oven, set it for 480, let it come up to temperature, and then let them sit for a half hour. And that will temper them. Okay? And then we'll look at the final product. Okay, we're set with these, but before I talk about how the final tempering went, I just want to go back to a thought. Between doing the heat treat and doing the tempering, I found a little tool. This was $3 at a little antique shop. It's a cow horn cobbler's awl for widening holes in leather after they've been pierced with a smaller, sharper awl. And what's interesting about it for this conversation is this is made from a file the same way that these were. Remember I said in the previous clip, if you're making something from a file, you must file off all of the teeth. Okay? The base of each tooth has a crack in it, and that has to be removed in order to have a consistent piece of metal. But it is a thing that has been done for a very long time, very traditional, taking an old file that is completely beyond use and using it some other way. Okay? Now, nobody would ever buy a file in the old days to make another tool because a file was the most expensive tool because it had to be very good steel. In modern time, that's not true. There's a lot of files that are air hardening steel, which will not work with this because it won't soften. When you do the normalization, it will come out hard, and you'll never be able to file and work it. Okay, just if that happens, abandon ship, quit, get another piece of steel. If you're working a file that is case hardened, you will think everything is going well until you're done and you quench it and nothing happens. It never gets hard. So if you're going to use files, you have to be prepared for those two outcomes. Okay, that's why I don't like it. The older the file, the more likely it is to come out well, but it's a gamble. I mean, recycled steel is always a little bit of a gamble, but files are a little extra gamble. So these two came out very nicely. You can see the temper colors showing through. And I did set the oven for 480. And this one is absolutely perfectly what I hope to have happen. So you can see it's got the dark brown straw with a little bit of purple poking through. So that's right where I wanted this one to come out. Again, the long handle so that I can do cutting stroke with leverage with both hands. I do that with my favorite little carving knife here all the time, but I'm cupping my hands together. Okay, so that's why I wanted this with more leverage, so I can actually grasp the steel with both hands. This one, these were sitting right beside each other, just that far apart. This one went all the way to purple and blue, though I can still see a little bit of the straw in a couple places. So this must have been just directly underneath one of the electric heating coils. It just got enough extra radiant heat that it got a little bit hotter. So you can see a tempering color, some unevenness in the oven that I used, but that's okay. I'm totally fine with this result, particularly with these two pieces. This one is an older, came from an older trap. Had a little bit more carbon. I could tell the whole time I was working this had a little bit more carbon. So it was a little harder after the quench and softened up just a little bit more, getting a little bit warmer in the tempering. So that's a true, this is what you want a spring to look like when you're done tempering it. Okay, so that's very good there. And this one was a little bit softer. I'm betting that this is 1040, maybe 1060. But probably 1040. So since this was a softer steel, lower carbon to begin with, and I can tell that from the spark test that I did, knowing it had at least some carbon but not a ton, I'm totally cool with this coming out a little bit less softened because it was softer to begin with, and this a little bit more softened because it was harder to begin with. So with this, I'm going to call this stage of this project complete and finish up and upload the video. I'm going to handle these. I have some really interesting material that I'm going to use to handle these. But I'm going to do that in its own separate video. So if you want to see that, make sure that you subscribe. And if you want to see more projects like this and make it easier for us to be able to buy materials, find the time, support this, we have a Patreon page with lots of really good information available for you. All of the digital resources in the Patreon store are free to patrons at any tier. So if you wanted to wander over there and support the channel, we would be most grateful. But either way, I hope that you have a wonderful, blessed day, and we'll see you here next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.